There is a version of this story that Cornelia Voss's publicist released to the press the following Monday morning, and it describes a minor security incident at the Foundation's annual gala that is currently under review. That version is 4 sentences long. It does not mention the vitrine. It does not mention what was inside it. It does not mention what was found in its place. This is the other version. 500 people were in that ballroom on Saturday night. 2 private security contractors stood within arm's reach of the most valuable object in the room for 6 consecutive hours. Every angle of the vitrine was covered by 4 cameras, whose footage was reviewed frame by frame for 3 days afterward by a firm that bills $400 an hour and has never failed to identify a point of entry in 11 years of post-incident analysis. At the end of those 3 days, the firm's lead investigator submitted a report. The report's conclusion, rendered in the careful language of professionals who do not like admitting what they cannot explain, was that the exchange had occurred, that the object was gone, that what had been left in its place had been left deliberately, and that the footage, in its entirety, did not show a single moment that could be identified as the moment it happened. The investigator had one other note, appended at the bottom of the report in language slightly less careful than the rest. The photographer whose credentials were on file for the evening could not be located for follow-up interview. His agency confirmed the booking. His invoice was paid. His photographs, 312 of them technically excellent, delivered to the Foundation's communications director by encrypted transfer the following morning, showed every corner of that ballroom, every notable guest, every detail of the floral arrangements and the lighting and the speeches, and not one frame that answered the only question anyone in that room actually had. Nobody in that building knew what they were supposed to have been looking for. That was the whole point. It started, as these things tend to, not with a crime, but with a Thursday morning and a piece of paper that had no business being where it was. Cornelia Voss had a ritual she had maintained for 11 years without interruption. Every Thursday at 9 in the morning, she signed the Foundation's weekly grant disbursements. This was not a task she delegated. She had explained this to 3 successive executive directors, each of whom had suggested with increasing delicacy that her time might be better spent on higher-order strategic decisions, and each of whom had received the same answer. The signature was the point. The signature was visible proof, repeated weekly, that the money moved with her hand behind it. She had built a career on the perception of personal stewardship, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who had made that perception the load-bearing wall of her public identity, that you do not delegate the gestures that define you. So, on the Thursday before the gala at 9 in the morning, she walked to the printer outside her office to collect the disbursement sheets, and she found on top of them a single page on her own Foundation letterhead. The letterhead was correct in every detail. The Foundation's name in the right typeface, the address in the right point size, the small seal in the upper left corner that had been designed by a graphic firm she'd paid well for and used exclusively. Where the name of the grant recipient should have been, there was one line of text, centered, in the same font as the rest of the document. Something that left their hands and arrived in yours will return to where it came from on Saturday night. You chose the stage. I chose the moment. No signature, no date, nothing else. Voss stood at the printer for a moment that she would later describe to her attorney as less than 30 seconds. Then she picked up both the disbursement sheets and the page, walked back to her office, and closed the door. She read the line 3 more times. She considered briefly the possibility that it was a mistake, that someone had printed the wrong document, That there was a mundane explanation involving a shared printer and a misdirected file. She dismissed that possibility in the time it took to look at the letterhead again. The letterhead was not something you could access by accident. The letterhead file lived in a folder on the Foundation's internal server, used only for official correspondence, accessible only to her and her executive director and the communications manager, who produced the quarterly reports. She called her head of security before she called anyone else. His name was Gerald Park, and he had spent 8 years running security for a family office in Midtown before Voss hired him away with a title upgrade and a compensation package that had made the decision easy. Park listened to her, read the note aloud, asked her to read it a second time, and said 2 things: that they should treat it as credible until proven otherwise, and that he would need the full vendor and staffing list for the gala by end of day. She gave him the disbursement sheets to her assistant through a cracked door and told her assistant to handle the signatures. It was the first Thursday in 11 years she hadn't signed them herself. She did not tell anyone else about the note that day. On Friday, she told her attorney, a man named Richard Four, who had represented her in the provenance dispute and who had the particular quality she valued most in legal counsel, which was that he never expressed alarm in a way that could be read on his face. Farrer read the note, set it down on his desk, and said that it was almost certainly an attempt at psychological pressure preceding a civil action. A new filing, perhaps from the same parties as the prior dispute, using theatrical means to create a climate of anxiety before formal proceedings. He said the language was designed to seem specific while committing to nothing actionable. He said she should not respond, should not acknowledge it to anyone connected to the gala, and should let Park do his job. She asked him whether he thought it was serious. He said that in his experience, people who were actually planning something didn't announce it. She found this reassuring in the way that plausible logic is always reassuring when you have already decided to be reassured. What she did not do, and what Four did not suggest, was cancel the gala. This was understandable. The gala was not merely a fundraising event, it was the annual public expression of the Foundation's identity, attended by 500 people whose opinion of Cornelia Voss was the substrate on which her entire professional and social existence rested. Canceling it, or even visibly disrupting it in response to a single unsigned note, would have required an explanation, and any explanation would have required disclosing the note, and disclosing the note would have required answering questions about what it meant. And answering those questions would have meant opening a conversation about the provenance dispute that Four had spent 4 years and considerable billable hours helping her close. The gala would proceed. Park would add resources. The note would remain between her, Four, and the locked drawer of her desk. On Friday afternoon, Park brought in 2 additional security contractors and briefed his full team on the situation without reading them the note. He told them there had been a credible threat of an attempted theft of the main display piece, and that the vitrine was to be treated as a hard perimeter for the duration of the event. He established an exclusion zone 6 feet in every direction from the case, and assigned 2 contractors to maintain physical proximity to it throughout the evening. He reviewed the camera coverage with the building's facilities manager and identified one blind spot in the northeastern corner of the ballroom that had been acceptable for a social event and was not acceptable for a security operation. He had a 4th camera installed on Friday morning. He requested the full vendor list from the event coordinator, a woman named Isabel Reyes, who ran the Foundation's annual event with the systematic precision of someone who had long since stopped finding any part of it surprising. The list came back by noon. Catering, florals, valet, AV, and photography. Park ran checks on the catering and valet staff. He flagged 2 names for follow-up and cleared both by Friday evening. He reviewed the AV contractor's event history, 3 previous foundation galas, no incidents, and the photography contractor's booking record. The photographer was listed as an independent operator who worked through an agency that placed editorial and event photographers for institutional clients across the city. The agency had placed him at 6 foundation events in the past 2 years, none of them Voss's. His credentials were on file. His equipment list had been submitted in advance, as required. Park noted him in the log and moved on. The catering supervisor had a sealed misdemeanor from 2019. Park spent 45 minutes on that and cleared it. The vitrine had been installed in the center of the ballroom 3 days before the event, as it was every year. It was custom built for the foundation's annual display. Tempered glass panels in an aluminum frame, a biometric lock on the rear access panel that required Voss's thumbprint, and a 6-digit code. A passive alarm system connected to the building's central security panel that would trigger if the case was opened without the code sequence being entered first. The piece inside it, the reason the note had used the word theirs, was a brooch. Platinum setting, 34 stones. The largest, a cushion-cut sapphire of 18 carats that had been certified by 2 independent appraisers at a combined value that made it the single most expensive object the foundation had ever displayed at the gala. Voss had acquired it at auction 7 years ago. The acquisition had been clean. She had outbid 3 other parties at a house in Geneva, paid the invoice within 30 days, and taken possession with full documentation. What the documentation did not address, because documentation of this kind is not designed to address such things, was the history of the piece before it arrived at the auction house. That history was the subject of the civil action that Four had helped her win. The family who brought the suit, a woman named Camille Osei and her 2 brothers, grandchildren of the collector who had originally owned the brooch, had claimed that the piece had been sold under duress in 1971 when their grandfather, facing a liquidity crisis manufactured in part by a business partner who later acquired several of his assets at distressed prices, had accepted a fraction of its market value from a dealer whose provenance trail, when traced, led eventually to the Geneva auction house and eventually to Cornelia Voss. The family had documentation. They had letters. They had a valuation report from 1969, 2 years before the sale, that established what the piece had been worth before the crisis and what their grandfather had accepted for it. The gap between those 2 numbers was not ambiguous. Fora's strategy had not been to dispute the facts. It had been to dispute the relevance of the facts to the current legal question, which was not whether the original sale had been fair, but whether Voss, as a good faith purchaser at a legitimate auction, bore any legal liability for what had occurred 50 years before she bought it. He had been correct on the law. The case was dismissed. The family had received, as part of a settlement that Four had structured carefully, a sum that was publicly described as a goodwill contribution, and that was, in practice, a number calibrated to make the suit go away without constituting an admission of anything. Camille Osei had accepted it because she had run out of money to keep fighting, and because her attorney, who was good but not as well resourced as Four, had told her it was the realistic outcome. She had signed the agreement. She had cashed the check. She had never spoken publicly about any of it because the agreement contained a non-disclosure clause that Four had insisted on, and she had had no leverage to resist. The gentleman had read the filing. He had read the letters the family submitted as exhibits. He had read Osei's declaration, which was 8 pages long and written in the plain, careful language of someone who had been told by her attorney to state facts and omit emotion, and who had done her best to comply while the emotion was visible anyway in the spaces between sentences. He had read the settlement agreement, which was not public, but which, like most documents that are not public, existed in more places than the parties who signed it believed it did. He'd been thinking about it for some time before the Thursday when Cornelia Voss found a page on her own letterhead in her printer and stood there for less than 30 seconds deciding what to do about it. He had not been angry when he decided to act. He had registered the situation the way he registered all situations that fell within his particular field of attention, as a problem with a structure, a set of variables, and a solution that had not yet been located, but that was, in his experience, always there. He had thought about it for a while. Then he had begun. He had attended the prior year's gala as a guest of a foundation board member. He had met at a conference on cultural repatriation 6 months earlier. He had been introduced to Voss briefly, unremarkably, in the way that people are introduced at events attended by 500 people. A handshake, a sentence about the work of the foundation, a movement onto the next conversation. He had observed the ballroom layout, the vitrine placement, the security positioning, the flow of vendors in and out of the service entrance, the behavior of the event coordinator, the way the photography team moved through the crowd. He had noted the photographer's access, the freedom of movement that a camera conferred, the invisibility of professional purpose in a room full of people performing social visibility. He had filed it all away with the specific kind of attention that looks, from the outside, exactly like polite interest in an event he had been invited to attend. He had also noted that evening where the printer was. The event photographer booked for this year's gala had been contracted through the same agency that handled the previous year's booking. The agency received a call 11 days before the event from a coordinator representing a corporate client that needed to release its previously contracted photographer for a conflict date. The agency, which operated on a placement model and earned its margin on availability, confirmed the opening and filled it. The replacement photographer's portfolio was strong: editorial credits, several institutional galas, a recommendation from a client the agency had worked with for 4 years. His equipment list was submitted within 24 hours. His credentials were processed without incident. Isabel Reyes received his confirmation the following morning and updated her master vendor document, which she maintained with the systematic precision that made her very good at her work. The agency did not know that the conflict date had been created. The previous photographer did not know his booking had been released. These things happen in the event industry with enough regularity that neither the agency nor Reyes had any reason to examine the sequence. A booking was canceled. A replacement was found. The paperwork was correct. Gerald Park received the updated vendor list and logged the new photographer against the original entry. The booking history was shorter than the previous photographer's, but it was clean. He noted it and moved forward. He had a catering supervisor with a sealed misdemeanor to clear, and 2 contractors to vet, and a camera blind spot to address, and a principal who was checking in with him every 4 hours. The photographer was the least of his concerns. Do you know that feeling of watching something that seems entirely ordinary, and something in the back of your mind keeps insisting that you're missing the point? That the ordinary thing is not the thing you're supposed to be looking at, but you can't locate what you're supposed to be looking at instead? That was the experience of everyone in that ballroom on Saturday night, who, in retrospect, was asked to remember the photographer. They remembered him the way you remember the furniture in a room where something important happened. Present, unremarkable, part of the background. He moved through the crowd with the specific efficiency of someone who knows where the light is and where it isn't, who understands that the best photographs at events like this come from the edges rather than the center, who positions himself with a kind of purposeful drift that takes him over the course of an evening to every corner of the room. He photographed the guests. He photographed the speeches. He photographed the floral arrangements and the catering stations and the vitrine, which made an excellent subject. The light caught the sapphire in a way that the foundation's communications director later said was the best photograph of the piece she had ever seen. He was, by every account, exactly what his credentials said he was. Two of the security contractors stationed near the vitrine were asked during the post-incident review whether they had noticed him. Both said yes. Both said he had approached the exclusion zone twice during the evening, and both times had stopped at the perimeter, photographed the case from outside it, and moved on. Neither had found this suspicious. Photographing the display piece was obviously part of the photographer's job. The exclusion zone was maintained. He never crossed it. The cameras covering the vitrine recorded him in the frame on 4 separate occasions over the course of the evening. In each instance, he was outside the perimeter, camera raised, doing exactly what a photographer at a gala is supposed to do. The biometric lock on the vitrine required Voss's thumbprint and a 6-digit code. The passive alarm required the code sequence to be entered within 30 seconds of the thumbprint scan, or it would trigger. The code had been set by Voss personally on the day the vitrine was installed, using the keypad on the rear access panel. She had entered it twice to confirm it. She had not written it down. She had not told anyone what it was. She had confirmed this to Park on Friday afternoon when he asked, and he had accepted it as the most secure arrangement available. A code known only to the principal, with no written record, was by definition a code that could not be extracted from any other source. The ballroom had 500 people in it for 6 hours. Gerald Park was in the room for all 6 of them. Isabel Reyes managed the event from a position near the service entrance, which was where she always managed it from. Close enough to the kitchen to coordinate the catering timing. Close enough to the AV station to handle any technical issues. Far enough from the guests to be useful rather than ornamental. She had been doing this for 11 years, and she ran a clean event. Nothing went wrong with the catering. Nothing went wrong with the lighting. The speeches ran 4 minutes over schedule, which was better than average. At 10:47 p.m., the last scheduled program item concluded, and the room transitioned to open social time. At 11:14 p.m., Cornelia Voss was standing near the bar on the east side of the ballroom, in conversation with 2 board members and a donor whose annual contribution represented 12% of the foundation's operating budget. She was doing what she did at every gala, moving through the room with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a career making other people feel that their presence is the thing she had most been hoping for. She was, by her own account, not thinking about the vitrine. She had checked it twice during the evening, visually, from across the room. Both times it had been exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly as it was supposed to be, lit by the uplight that showed the sapphire to its best advantage, flanked by the 2 contractors who had not moved from their position in 6 hours. At 11:22 p.m., one of the contractors approached her. He said something to her quietly. She excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked with him to the vitrine. The case was intact. The glass was undamaged. The lock showed no sign of tampering. The alarm had not triggered, not once, not for a fraction of a second, at any point during the evening. The 2 cameras covering the rear access panel had recorded nothing that should not have been there. The vitrine was empty. Where the brooch had rested on its velvet stand, there was a catalog. An auction catalog, the kind printed on heavy stock for high-value sales, open to a specific page. The page showed the brooch, the same piece, the same photograph used in the original lot listing, and next to the image, 2 numbers had been written in clean, even handwriting. The first was the auction hammer price, what Voss had paid in Geneva 7 years ago. The second was the figure from the settlement agreement, the amount the Osei family had received to close their claim and sign the non-disclosure and never speak about any of it publicly again. Below the 2 numbers, nothing. No name, no note, no explanation. The arithmetic was self-evident. Voss stood in front of the open vitrine for what the contractor later estimated was somewhere between 45 seconds and a minute. She did not make a sound. The guests nearest to her continued their conversations. The bar continued to operate. The room did not know yet that anything had changed. Park arrived beside her within 30 seconds of the contractor's alert and took in the scene with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have trained themselves not to show the thing they are actually feeling when the thing they are actually feeling is something they were paid not to let happen. He called his team lead. He asked for a quiet sweep of the building. He asked Reyes, who arrived at his elbow within 2 minutes, to begin managing the room's exit in the normal way. End of evening. Thank you for coming. Good night. She did this without asking why, which was one of the qualities that made her very good at her work. The guests began to leave in the natural rhythm of an event that had concluded. Nobody was stopped. Nobody was searched. Stopping guests and searching them would have required an explanation, and an explanation would have required disclosing what had happened. And Park had not yet been told by his principal whether she wanted it disclosed. She did not. He found her in the small room behind the ballroom stage, the one used for speakers to collect themselves before going on. She was sitting in one of the chairs arranged for that purpose, and she was looking at the catalog, which she had picked up from the vitrine and carried with her. She was not crying. She was not visibly distressed in the way that distress usually presents. She was looking at the catalog the way you look at a document that contains information you have spent a significant amount of time and money ensuring that nobody would ever be able to put in front of you in a room you couldn't leave. The 2 numbers were still there. The arithmetic was still self-evident. Park told her his team had swept the building. No one matching any unusual description had been found. The exits had been covered within 4 minutes of his alert. The photographer, he noted, had submitted his deliverables by encrypted transfer at 11:31 p.m., 9 minutes after the discovery, and was not located in the building during the sweep. His contact information was on file with the agency. Park would follow up in the morning. She nodded. She said she would call Faur. Park said that was a good idea. He asked whether she wanted to call the police. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would speak to Faur first. Park did not push. He understood, without it being stated, the specific geometry of her situation, that calling the police would require describing what had been taken and what had been left, and describing those things would require addressing the context in which they made sense. And addressing that context would mean opening a conversation that the non-disclosure agreement had been specifically designed to prevent her from having to open. The brooch was gone. The catalog was in her hands. The room outside was emptying. This is what was known in the days that followed by the people who were paid to know things. Park's follow-up with the photographer's agency established that the individual who had replaced the original booking had provided credentials that were accurate in every verifiable particular: portfolio, references, equipment list. and that the agency had no record of having placed him before this engagement, which was unusual but not unprecedented for a photographer of his experience level moving between agencies. The contact number on file rang without answer. The email address on file received Park's inquiry and did not reply. The agency, embarrassed and cooperative, confirmed that they had no physical address for him, that he had been paid via direct transfer to an account that was subsequently found to be associated with a shell entity, and that the conflict that had freed up the original photographer's booking had originated from a client that, when contacted, had no record of making the call. The original photographer, reached on Monday morning, confirmed that his booking had been released, and that he had found this surprising, but had assumed an administrative reason. He had been paid his cancellation fee. He had not asked questions. The post-incident security review identified the camera placement as adequate, the staffing as appropriate, the perimeter as maintained, and the lock as uncompromised. The biometric reader showed one access event during the evening, time-stamped at a moment when the footage showed the two contractors in their assigned positions, the nearest guests at a distance of 12 feet, and the photographer, per the camera's record, on the far side of the ballroom, photographing a table of donors. The access event lasted 11 seconds. The alarm did not trigger. The lock re-engaged. The footage showed nothing that should not have been there. The investigative firm's lead analyst reviewed the biometric log and the camera footage for 3 days. His report described the event as technically inexplicable, given the available evidence, and noted that the most probable explanation involved a level of advanced preparation that could not have been improvised. He noted one anomaly in the camera timeline, a 17-second gap in the feed from one of the two cameras covering the rear access panel, attributed by the building's facilities manager to a brief network interruption consistent with the building's documented connectivity pattern on high-attendance evenings. The gap had occurred at 11:09 p.m. The analyst noted it. He could not, based on the available evidence, establish what it signified. Richard Four arrived at Voss's office on Sunday morning. He looked at the catalog. He looked at the two numbers in their clean, even handwriting. He set it down and said, in the careful language of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at, that the settlement agreement was still in force, and that Camille Osei and her brothers were still bound by the non-disclosure clause, regardless of what had occurred at the gala. He said that pursuing legal action regarding the theft would require Voss to describe the calling card, which would require describing the two numbers, which would require explaining what those numbers represented, which would effectively require her to disclose the existence and terms of the settlement in a public proceeding. He said this was her decision to make, not his, but that she should understand the shape of the decision before she made it. She asked him whether there was any other available action. He said that the piece itself was gone, that it could be reported as stolen, but that the investigation would surface the same issues, that the calling card's meaning was, in effect, a form of proof, not legal proof, not proof that could be used in any proceeding without cost, but a kind of clarity that was now in existence and could not be made not to exist. He said he was sorry. He said it the way lawyers say they are sorry, when what they mean is that they have correctly identified the structure of a situation that is not going to improve. She did not call the police. The security incident was described in the Publicist's Monday release as a minor security matter under review. The vitrine was removed from the ballroom and returned to storage. The Foundation's communications director published the gala photographs on the Foundation's website on Tuesday. 312 images. Technically excellent. Every corner of the ballroom documented with the care of someone who was paying close attention to the room. The sapphire brooch was not in any of the photographs. The photographer had not photographed it after 9:45 p.m. Nobody noticed this for several weeks. The gentleman was in a city he had been to twice before when the photographs went live on Tuesday morning. He read the publicist's statement on his phone in the kind of diner that exists in every American city and is never the place anyone means when they say they know a good place for breakfast. Formica counter, coffee that arrives without being requested, a television mounted high on the wall showing the local news. He read the 4 sentences. He noted the careful language. He set his phone down and finished his coffee. The waitress refilled it without asking. He thought about Camille Osier, who had signed a document under duress and accepted a number that was calibrated to be enough to stop fighting with, and not enough to constitute an acknowledgement of anything, and who had probably spent some portion of the years since then working out what it meant that the only available outcome was the one that required her silence. He thought about what it was like to lose something your grandfather had built, not once, but twice. Once when it was taken, and once when the law declined to help you get it back. He had not told her what he was going to do. He had not contacted her at all. What happened on Saturday night was between him and Cornelia Voss, and the resolution of it was between the Osei family and whatever they decided to do now that the non-disclosure agreement had become, effectively, a document that protected a secret that was no longer entirely secret. He did not know what they would do. That was not his part of it. His part was to put the truth in the room in a form that couldn't be removed, and to make sure the person who had kept it out of the room understood, with full clarity, that it had arrived. He had left the catalog open to the right page. He had written the 2 numbers himself in the handwriting he used when he wanted something to feel personal rather than procedural. He had not written anything else because anything else would have been editorial, and the situation did not require editorializing. The numbers were their own argument. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. The brooch was by this point somewhere that neither Gerald Park, nor Richard Four, nor the investigative firm, nor Cornelia Voss's considerable resources were likely to locate it in a time frame that would be useful to them. This was by design. The gentleman had a view on the question of where things that left someone's hands under duress ought to eventually end up, and that view had shaped some of the practical decisions he had made in the weeks preceding the gala. He was not a foundation. He did not have a legal mechanism for restitution. What he had was a long-standing relationship with a particular kind of patience, and a set of connections in the world of cultural property that he had cultivated over years for reasons that included this one. What eventually happened to the brooch is a different story, and one that is not his to tell. He paid for his coffee and left a tip that was larger than the bill, as he always did in places where the coffee came without being requested, because that particular form of attention deserved to be recognized. He walked out into the morning. The city was doing what cities do at that hour, opening up, resuming, proceeding with the ordinary business of being a place where people live. He had a train to catch. He caught it. The afternoon after the gala, before the sweep of the building was complete, and before Four had been called, and before the publicist had been retained to craft 4 careful sentences, Gerald Park had stood in the small room behind the stage and looked at his principal sitting with the catalog in her hands, and he had thought, not as a security professional, not in his professional capacity at all, but as a person who had spent 8 years in that industry and understood the distance between what things look like and what they are, he had thought that the person who had done this had been in that room the entire evening, had been in photographs that were now on a website, had photographed everything except what he had come to take. Park had spent 3 days trying to locate him and had not succeeded. And on the 4th day, he had stopped trying. Not because he had given up, but because he had arrived slowly at the understanding that the person he was looking for had not made a mistake, and that the absence of a mistake was a form of message in itself. He had been in that room. He had done what he said he was going to do. He had left proof that he had done it, and proof of why. And he had walked out through the front entrance at 11:31 p.m. while the guests were still saying their goodbyes, and the bar was still open, and nobody in the building knew yet that anything had changed. Park was not an emotional man. He had chosen a profession that rewarded the suppression of emotion in the presence of events that warranted it. But he sat with that understanding for a while. The understanding that the best security operation he had ever run had not been enough. Not because it had been inadequate, but because the person on the other side of it had seen the whole board before the evening started. And he found that he could not locate in any honest part of himself the feeling that the wrong outcome had occurred. He did not say this to Voss. He did not say it to anyone. It was not the kind of thing you said out loud in his profession, but he thought it in the way that people think things they know to be true and cannot act on, which is to say, quietly, and once, and with a completeness that left nothing to add. The numbers were still in the catalog. The arithmetic was still self-evident. If you made it this far, you already understand what this episode was actually about. Not a theft, not a security failure, not a gala that went sideways. It was about a transaction that happened 50 years ago, and another one that happened 7 years ago, and a third one that happened in a lawyer's office when a family ran out of money to keep fighting, and about the question of whether the law settling something is the same as the thing being settled. The gentleman's answer to that question is not a speech. It's what he does on a Saturday night in a room full of 500 people, while every camera in the building is pointed at the thing he's already decided to move. Here's what I want to ask you before you go. If someone handed you that catalog, opened that page with those 2 numbers, and you knew the whole story behind them, would you believe it was possible that nobody in that room saw it happen? Or does that feel like exactly the kind of thing that happens over and over in plain sight, and we just don't have a name for it? If this story stayed with you, hit like and subscribe. These stories take time to find and time to tell right, and every person who subscribes is one more reason to keep finding them. There's more coming, including one that starts not in a ballroom but in a library, with a document that had been misfiled, and a man who noticed something that 11 other people had walked past without seeing. And before you close this out, one more question, one I keep coming back to myself. If someone told you this story without any of the proof, just the facts and the arithmetic and the empty vitrine, would you have believed it? What would it take to convince you that the impossible thing actually happened? Leave that in the comments. I want to know what it would take.